Hi, this is Karen Rainford. I'm here to talk to you about Chapter 4 from Project Management Jumpstart for MG408 Project Management. What should I study in Chapter 4? Chapter 4 says that it's about project goals, but it's also about the things that make up goals, such as requirements, assumptions, and scope. The important piece about figuring out what the goals are on a project is, are we done yet, and were we successful? There is a discussion in Heldman about objectives versus goals. As far as I'm concerned, objectives and goals can be used interchangeably, and she actually says that as well. In terms of how we write goals, it's really important that they be specific, measurable, achievable, realistic, and time-bound. For each project, you want one goal or many. Most people, in order to be time-bound, you usually have to have several different goals because there are things that have to be delivered at different times. And sometimes it's helpful just to have one overarching goal and then break that down into several smaller goals or deliverables. Deliverables are actually measurable outcomes, results, or items. The nice thing about a deliverable is that it's easy to prove. It's very tangible. Either the report is finished, it's been turned in, or it hasn't. We can measure whether or not a deliverable meets requirements. And it always takes action to produce the deliverables, but writing the report is the task. The report itself is actually what the deliverable is. Often deliverables have several parts and pieces that happen over a longer period of time. But in general, any deliverable at any given moment is either complete or not complete. Requirements are actually a further breakdown of deliverables. Often we hear the term specifications used in this manner as well. Discovering requirements can be very tricky. As you go out and gather requirements, it helps to discuss things because even if you get things in writing, so often there's a different idea between what one person says and what another person means. When we look at requirements, we want to get down to some lowest level component so that we know that we have described something at a very specific level. There are competing needs. I may want a 45-page report, but you may only want to produce a 4-page report. That's an example of competing needs. Another part of requirements is that some of them are more critical than others. It may be very, very important to me that it works, but it may not be as important to me that something is blue. So those highly critical deliverables and requirements are often called critical success factors. One of the parts that can trip you up most easily in a project are assumptions. For planning purposes, you really don't know everything up front, so you have to decide ahead of time, what am I going to assume that's true, real or certain? And then you need to document those assumptions. What this lets you do is it lets you move ahead with planning your project. People will say, well, I don't know yet whether it's going to be A or B. And we say, I've documented that I'm assuming it's going to be A, and I based my plan on that. This is especially important with vendors because vendors quote us prices based on either A or B, but not both, unless it's an optional kind of price. So even if something turns out later to be not true, you planned it in good faith, you documented the basis upon which you planned it, and that is really the best we can do in projects. One of the things that is difficult about projects is that there are many, many constraints. Constraints are things that limit what we can do in terms of project plans. People have talked a lot about the triple constraint, which is scope, schedule, and budget, but there's also quality, customer satisfaction, and a number of other constraints or limitations that we need to worry about. One of the most frequent places that constraints come from is policies, rules, or regulations. If you need a city permit in order to build something, you can't make the decision, oh, well, we'll do this one without a permit because we really don't have time to get it. It's a constraint. We need to meet constraints, and we need to plan the project in a way so that the constraints will be met. That brings us to the point of looking at project scope statement. Things are either in the project or not in the project. It's kind of like a box. It's either in the box or it's not in the box. If it's hanging over the edge and nobody knows whether it's in or out, and you go to put the box on the back of a truck, you're going to have a problem with those things that are hanging over the edge and barely hanging on. One of the things that helps us really understand what is in the box is to be very specific about what is not in the box, that is, the exclusions. We also want to know what the acceptance criteria is, because if I tell you that I will give you a can of soda, it matters to you whether or not it's cold, whether or not it's flat, whether or not it's delivered on time. So the acceptance criteria for that particular deliverable need to be very specific. And getting sign-off on what is in scope and what is not in scope is really a key part of the project planning process. Once we have a project scope statement, people always want to change it. But we can't, after it's been signed off and approved, we can't just go saying, okay, that's fine, let's just throw in that extra item, even though it will double the cost of the project. So how do we add a new deliverable? And how do we remove or modify one? How do we request a change to what is in that scope box? And how are changes approved or denied? Typically, what the scope management plan does is set up some kind of a process, a form that people have to fill out, a group that makes the decisions about whether or not the scope is going to change. And it helps because it communicates to everyone so that everyone who might be impacted by the change gets a chance to consider what that change would do to them. A communications plan. If we just send everything to everyone, no one reads it. So we need to figure out who needs to know, what they need to know, when they need to know it. Are we going to push the information out to them in an email, or are we going to put the information on a website and assume that they will pull the information? How often? And the opposite is true as well. How will I, as a project manager, get the information I need from team members and stakeholders? That's the end of Chapter 4. Take a look at the terminology and review the questions. I'll see you on the next chapter.